When I was asking Reverend Dr. Mr. Legault how I could introduce our next speaker, he said, "Get a pen." And it's really true, because we have one of the biggest influences and leading minds in understanding counterterrorism and national security in Nick Rasmussen. We're so lucky that he is here to share these words with us. He has served under 4 different presidential administrations. He led the NCTC. He was out working at the global, sorry, I'm going to botch that, Nick, but anyway, he has had a wonderful resume in national security. We're so lucky to have him. You don't need to hear from me. I'd like to spend our time with him, and then you get to ask some questions. So we will do a Q&A with him. So please be thinking of what you would like him to answer. Without further ado, Nick, please come up. Thank you.
So thanks, Aaron, thanks, Gina, and thank you to the entire NCITE team here in Omaha for the invitation to be here this week. As Gina knows, it's a long overdue visit for me. This was something I'd been intending to do at a much earlier stage of my time at DHS and just simply hadn't found the time, and I'm glad this event created that opportunity. It's especially good to be outside DC and to be among so many scholars and practitioners whose work I have admired and relied upon across the many years that I've been involved with counterterrorism in my current role at DHS, but also in the several other CT-related jobs I've held, of which there seem to have been too many. When I hear keynote speech at a conference I'm attending, I usually get a little bit of a shiver, thinking somebody's going to talk at me for a long period of time, and that is certainly not my intention today. I want to get to the point where this is also a conversation. I don't want to be talking at you. There's so much knowledge and experience and understanding in this room. I'd rather be talking with you. So I'm going to offer some observations, but then hopefully move to a place where we can get to the Q&A. But before jumping in on the substance, and I'm going to say this without her here because she had to depart a bit early, I wanted to do a little bit of tribute paying to Martha Crenshaw. I've said it publicly before, but I'll say it what I thought was going to be in her presence, but she said she's going to watch the video later. No syllabus that aims to teach anybody about CT or about terrorism would be complete without her writings being covered in weeks 1, 2, or 3. And I know that because I've assigned those readings in courses I've taught as adjuncts or along the way. And so it remains true, no matter how dated those writings may be, they are as relevant, as fresh, and as impactful as they ever were. For most of you, you likely associate Dr. Crenshaw with her Stanford professorship and her current academic home, but for me, that's not how I think about her at all. For me, she will always be the rock star professor of government in what was a rock star-filled Department of Government at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, which is my alma mater. Almost 40 years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Wesleyan, she was already the foremost scholar in the field that we're all here to talk about today. And she sat among a distinguished group of government department colleagues that motivated me to pursue a career in public service. Names that I'll just rattle off now that don't mean anything to you, but who were her colleagues in that government department. Robert Wood, a former Secretary of Health and Human Services, Brian Fay, Donald Moon. Again, names that don't resonate with you, but I know Professor Crenshaw knows exactly of what I speak. And I didn't back then have enough foresight as an undergraduate, 19, 20, 21 years old, to know where I would go with my career and how much of that career would end up being focused on this terrorism set of issues. But even on campus back then, I think the students that she had knew they were being exposed to world-class teaching and world-class scholarship on political violence and on terrorism. So to know that Martha is still part of the NCITE team and is actively engaged in contributing and shaping that work is hugely rewarding to me personally. I want briefly to talk about 3 things, and as I said, get to some Q&A. First, the threat. I'll come back to that in a minute, but what I really want to do is unpack where I think we stand at the present with a special focus on the homeland. Second, I want to talk a bit about the toolkit that we have at our disposal to manage our counterterrorism challenges and to do what we try to do, which is to mitigate and manage risk. That's a phrase I end up using again and again and again these days, is mitigating and managing risk, buy down risk. Because there's no way for us to work our way out of the terrorism set of challenges we have, but we can sensibly manage and mitigate risk. And that's what I find is a useful way for us to frame much of what we are doing at present. And third, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the workforce that carries out terrorism and counterterrorism-related work and ends up carrying the load in all of this work on our behalf. And I'll try to do all of that in about 20 or 30 minutes, and then, as I said, leave as much time for conversation. The threat. I used to have this responsibility to do this all the time as director of NCTC, and I was often called upon to articulate either in a classified or an unclassified setting the details of the threat environment and to try to make sense of what we should be worried about and most worried about. And it seemed at every phase of my counterterrorism career we would say, and we'd say this with genuine conviction and honesty, it's harder now, today, here in this moment than it's ever been before. We face more challenges, harder challenges, and I'm not going to disappoint you, I still kind of feel that way. Despite the fact that we've had enormous counterterrorism successes that have inflicted significant degradation on some of our most lethal terrorist adversaries, the homeland threat that we're facing today somehow seems more challenging, more complex, and more complicated than it's ever been. We continue to face real challenges with homegrown violent extremists, HVEs, who form some version of a virtual connection to a foreign terrorist organization, to that group's narrative, to its worldview, to its set of political objectives, and then those individuals end up associating themselves to that group in a way that ultimately can lead to a terrorist act. And even as we get focused on other forms of terrorism here in the United States, like the DT version, HVEs still make up a large and very significant share of our threat profile here in the United States. I suspect if Director Wray were here from FBI, he'd affirm that the Bureau's HVE caseload reflects that and validates that point, even if we don't read about it as much in the news as we may have a few years ago. And then, of course, intermittently, but still not infrequently, we actually do see this in the news when arrests and prosecutions of HVE cases do pop into the news. Most recently, that happened in April when the Department of Justice charged an 18-year-old young man with material support to terrorism based on his intention to acquire weapons and carry out attacks in support of ISIS. Now, if you layer on top of that HVE threat the growing problem of domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism, it only adds to our challenges. And to be honest, when I re-entered government after a period away about 18 months ago at DHS, I expected that I'd be spending the vast majority of my time focused on DT things, DVE things. That's the problem set I thought I was coming back in to handle in a most hands-on way. It certainly felt like that was going to be job one for me as the DHS counterterrorism coordinator. The DVE threat, and particularly the part of that threat that ties to racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, or REMVs, continues to grow in scope and scale and, unfortunately, lethality. And events in Israel and Gaza only exacerbated that threat picture, with both the Jewish and Muslim American communities being at greater risk today of suffering attacks against their communities than they were before October 7th. And I don't need to tell this audience this, but I'll say it anyway. The toxic political environment in which we live as Americans right now, and the existentialist ways in which voices in our public square frame our politics in not only zero-sum terms, but the worst kind of zero-sum terms, all of that leaves us far more vulnerable than ever to targeted violence here, motivated by sets of different extreme political beliefs. And as both Americans and our foreign partners know, the United States is somewhat unique in the way we categorize and distinguish between so-called international terrorism and so-called domestic terrorism. We're unique in the way we talk about it that way. Most countries don't do that. In our case, though, I think it somehow ends up making some sense, even though I've argued that at different ways at different times. Because in the end, when we start thinking about toolkits and possible CT approaches to deal with our terrorism challenges, there is something that feels quite unique and different in the way we deal or have to deal with the DVE problem set as compared to other problem sets that we have. And that's something we can talk about in the Q&A a little bit later. Lastly, on the threat front, I want to highlight something that I definitely didn't anticipate when I joined DHS almost 20 months ago. And that is the way in which global migration patterns are putting pressure on our Homeland Security apparatus in a way that it intersects with our counterterrorism work. Most Americans by now are, of course, very familiar with the challenges that we face as a country in managing the flow of migrants to our southwest border. My secretary, my boss, Alejandro Mayorkas, has time and again made the case that our immigration system is fundamentally broken and requires far-reaching reform, legislative reform, not to mention a large infusion of additional resources to support the work that goes on at the border every day. And part of that challenge right now, a big part of that challenge right now, is also the diversity of the migrant population arriving at our borders. This is not in any way, shape, or form a problem of the Western Hemisphere. It's a global migration problem, with migrants from literally every corner of the world, including from most conflict zones around the world, showing up and arriving on our shores. DHS, of course, employs rigorous screening and vetting of those arriving migrants to try and identify any individual who may present a terrorism-related threat to the homeland. That work is done 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, by dedicated border security personnel, but also backed up by a large intelligence and law enforcement apparatus that exists to help them do that work. And those colleagues are doing everything they can to make sure that we can identify, that we have the latest and most up-to-date information that would allow us to identify individuals who may pose a threat. And even in the midst of all of that work, we find ourselves facing a situation in which individual migrants or travelers do arrive here. We have no derogatory information available to us that would indicate any terrorism or public safety related concern. And then we subsequently learn that an individual who has entered the U.S. does in fact pose some form of potential threat. Now, when that happens, we work quite effectively and quite closely with the FBI and local law enforcement around the country to deal with and mitigate that threat. That coordination is really, really quite good and was on display most recently during a set of highly publicized arrests of Central Asian individuals where the Department of Homeland Security and FBI worked hand in glove to carry out those law enforcement operations. But our work in this area would be so much more manageable, so much more achievable if we could identify those threats with good information when those threatening individuals were far, far, far away from our shore, before they had even embarked on a journey to the Western Hemisphere, and if they could be prevented from even traveling to our hemisphere in the first place. I could go on longer about this set of border issues, but suffice to say the relatively recent convergence of our migration problems on the one hand and our homeland terrorism concerns on the other hand has created new challenges that place more pressure on our law enforcement and intelligence authorities. Our CT community, I say this selfishly, I believe is the best in the world, but new and novel challenges, I would argue, are not something we need right now. So where does NCITE and NCITE's research agenda fit into this threat landscape that I've just described? With a threat landscape that's this dynamic, this challenging, this subject to rapid fire change based on socio-political developments both here and abroad, we simply must have the research community's help in staying on top of that evolving picture. We are today a CT community of finite resources, not something I ever thought I would say in the post-9/11 environment, but it's really true. I often talk about one of my successors at NCTC, Christy Abizaid, as being the first NCTC director who has ever had to deal with a declining resource picture, and how much more of a challenge that put on her and her leadership team than anything I faced as director. We must make choices and deal most urgently with the most threatening things on our worry list. We can't treat every region, every problem as a top-tier priority. We don't have that luxury. Scholars and researchers in this room and who are part of the NCITE effort help us make those prioritization decisions and help us distinguish between the most urgent and the only slightly less urgent of our terrorism problems. Now, coming from inside the government, I trust and value the intelligence community's central role in that process. We're always going to rely on our intelligence community, their unique and privileged access to information to help us reach those judgments. But I would argue that the community of academics and CT scholars has become an equal partner to the IC in helping government understand the threat and to help us buy down some measure of the risk that we face. So that's the threat environment. Let me talk a bit about part two, the toolkit. Here also, we're going to be reliant on the NCITE community and the global community of scholars and practitioners to help us fashion innovative strategies and capabilities to mitigate the new forms of threat that we face. And I can think of a couple of specific ways in which research and scholarship can help bolster our toolkit. First, with respect to new technologies and their impact on the CT environment. Not a day goes by right now that I or my colleagues don't somehow think about different sides of this technology coin. In the first instance, we're thinking about how our terrorist adversaries are using and making use of new technologies, and particularly artificial intelligence capabilities that are widely available, not expensive, and growing ever more ubiquitous and available to our terrorist adversaries as they advance their work. Of course, the other side of that coin, we ask ourselves, how can we harness those same capabilities to make more effective and more efficient use of the data that we have available to us, and to make sure that we stay ahead of that threat picture. Again, my boss, Secretary Mayorkas, had the foresight to create an AI task force at DHS, led by one of our most creative and innovative DHS leaders, Eric Heisen. And he created that task force because we need it. This is a terribly uncomfortable place for us to be, I would argue. As the United States, we always assume that we own and have the technological upper hand over our adversaries, that the asymmetry between nation-state and subnational actor always leaves us with at least that advantage, the technological advantage. And it doesn't feel that way right now, at least not to me. And I would hope that NCITE and the scholarly community could help us restore that sense of technological advantage that we're used to enjoying in any sort of conflict we may face in the future. The other toolkit-related issue that I wanted briefly to touch upon involves the work we do aimed at preventing targeted violence or terrorism from even happening. Again, because I've had a long career across a number of different jobs, I've been a part of, or at least on the margins of, prevention work from its earliest days in our counterterrorism community. That's what happens when you stick around too long. I think we've learned lots of lessons about what works and what doesn't seem to work in terms of engaging with communities and engaging with at-risk populations to help lower the risk that members of those communities might become radicalized and engage in some form of targeted violence. But a strategy of trial and error and simply learning by doing over time hardly seems sufficient to what we're doing. And it imposes costs when we get things wrong or take wrong turns. The research being done under NCITE auspices, and some of it was talked about right in the conversation we had just before lunchtime today, that research being done by NCITE, for example, related to behavioral threat assessments or how to create effective engagement strategies or off-ramping pathways, it's extremely critical to what we do at DHS. I suspect many of you in this room, most of you in this room will know Bill Braniff, Dr. Bill Braniff, my friend and colleague, who heads up our prevention work at DHS. Bill and I talk pretty much every day, often multiple times a day. And I know from speaking to Bill that accelerating the research underway to support prevention work, and especially that research that underpins our evolving public health-informed approach to prevention, remains among our most urgent priorities. We need data-driven analysis to validate, or equally important, to invalidate the new and novel approaches that are being talked about, tried, and tested in the prevention space. I probably feel more sense of urgency around this set of issues than any other because I feel the same pressure that Bill does. And again, we talk about it nearly every day. The prevention work that we do must not only be shown to be effective by the kind of analysis I described a minute ago, it must also be able to survive contact with all of the critics who are out there who would question our motives, question our intentions, and politicize the work that we are doing. And in this environment, this prevention work must also be scalable in that resource-constrained environment I mentioned a minute ago. So those of you in the room today who are focused on this set of topics, this subset of the overall set of topics that NCITE covers, should know that your work will be key to helping us make the right choices, winning the arguments that we need to win that will allow us to improve prevention outcomes and scale programs to meet the need that we have. So just yesterday, one of the reasons I didn't come yesterday earlier in the conference was that I wanted to stay in Washington and attend the finals of the student competition Event to Prevent, which is funded by the TVTP program, as most of you know. Watching students figure out over the course of a semester for credit how to build effective prevention campaigns on a very micro level inside their own university, college, or high school communities is about as energizing and inspiring as it gets when you watch those student presentations. But it also makes clear that we as a community need to do even more to innovate and understand what works and what doesn't work in this prevention space. The needs in the prevention space are urgent and they're acute, and we need the work of scholars like those associated with NCITE to sharpen our approaches, prove the value of our prevention toolkit, help us innovate, and help us fend off critics. It's that important. Lastly, the question of workforce resilience and development. I'll only make two brief points here. First, the obvious point that everyone in this room understands, and I know it's on the agenda for conversation this week. Terrorism-related work and counterterrorism-related work imposes costs on those who do it. It's deeply stressful, and it puts burdens on those who do it that other disciplines simply don't, especially on those who work the most closely and the most directly with the horrific content that permeates this ecosystem, and those who are exposed to the consequences of terrorist attacks. But even those who aren't swimming in that content live in a world where the mission that we're all involved with, is perceived as no-fail, with literally no margin for error. That imposes its own stress and its own mental toll. This simply isn't the case for most professional fields of endeavor, or even most government fields of endeavor. With that as our lot in life, though, as counterterrorism professionals, we simply must develop strategies to care for and contribute to the resilience of our respective workforces, and indeed all of our colleagues across the CT enterprise. And this is not only a government thing, I know that. During the few years that I was outside government, when I was heading up the GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, we devoted a lot of time and energy to thinking about how to protect people in the space who are engaged in the online work that keeps us safe. Research and scholarship will help us develop better and more effective ways of keeping our workforces safe, healthy, and feeling good about the work that they are doing. It's not enough simply to say, take a break for a few days and then to assume that everything is all right. And I know I would benefit from state-of-the-art research on how to manage the potential trauma and harm that is the inevitable byproduct of our work. I worried about it with my NCTC workforce, many of whom were viewing ISIS hostage videos or other horrific forms of terrorism content. And I worry about it with my DHS colleagues who work in that same no-fail environment where anything that slips through could be seen as the thing that results in an attack. So thank you to all of you who are contributing to this effort to bolster the resilience and health of the CT community. Lastly, from a workforce perspective, I worry about knowledge preservation and knowledge transfer to a newly arriving cadre of CT professionals, whether that's in academia or in government. The huge good news, in my mind, is that the pool of young people who want to join the community of CT and targeted violence professionals seems to me to be as deep, passionate, and talented as it has ever been. There's no lack of good people who want to join in this work. Applications at DHS, applications at NCTC, applications at GIFCT, everywhere I've worked, talent is in abundance because people are drawn to this work. But for many of those young people, they simply don't have the same frame of recent historical reference that some of their older peers would have. And as I was winding down my service at NCTC director in 2017, I saw that very vividly when older leaders of our organization would draw historical comparisons and contrasts between and among things that were embedded in our post-9/11 consciousness, but were unfamiliar, in some cases even unknown, to some of our younger colleagues. Not their fault, and I swear that's not just grumpy old person syndrome on my part. It was really true. We just simply lacked sometimes common vocabulary to talk to each other. And I really do believe that in the CT world, we learn so much from our past successes and even more so from our past failures as a community to prevent attacks, or even from our near misses. And as one generation of analysts, subject matter experts, and leaders gives way to another of equal talent and equal passion, I think we owe them structured ways of sharing that knowledge and experience. And I didn't always feel like we had that in place inside government. So I would welcome the thinking of this community on this question. Well-documented case studies of what are now long ago events or moments in our CT history, they're obviously an essential part, but are case studies enough as you pass down knowledge and understanding? I'm not sure that they are. Ours is obviously not the only profession that dwells on these questions and deals in an environment where things are changing rapidly or have a dynamic landscape. So there might be paradigms that we could adopt or borrow from other disciplines who've dealt with knowledge transfer among generations of scholars. But I know NCITE's growing body of scholarship and knowledge will serve us well in this effort. It will help us give our younger colleagues the best leg up that we can give them in dealing with today's CT challenges, and certainly it will help them deal with challenges that we can't even imagine yet in the CT space. So with that last conundrum as a challenge to the NCITE community, I'll just simply stop there and look forward to some conversation. So thank you, Gina and Aaron.
Thank you very much, Nick. Camden is walking around, and he will have a mic to distribute to those with questions. But let's just start where you ended on this generational difference in young people. As you know, in this audience, there's a lot of early career researchers here. There's a lot of students watching online. And, NCITE will get right on the case of doing some analysis about what they need to know. But can you think of like 3 things you would tell them if they want to pursue this as a career?
That's tough.
Or 4.
One thing that comes up quite often in my conversations with government colleagues, and I'm not sure that there's an analogous way of thinking about it in the academic sphere, but a large share of my colleagues doing counterterrorism work reached a point at some point in the post 9/11 period where they're asking themselves, am I going to do this forever? Am I going to do CT work from now until forever? They loved the mission was rewarding, they knew how important it was, but they were also, I think it was right to ask themselves, how did I end up here, and is this the way I should spend the rest of my career? Are there other national security challenges I could turn my attention to and contribute, having learned what I've learned in the CT world? And my advice was never I didn't try to tell anybody to do something or not do something, but one of the things I tried to argue was I think for a good period of time, the CT community inside the government gained a well-earned reputation of being the most integrated and well-coordinated national security mini community inside of our government. The levels of collaboration and coordination and cooperation far exceeded things that we did on other national security topics. So I think our cyber colleagues, our colleagues who work on transnational crime, often end up trying to emulate how do you create those same patterns of cooperative, bureaucratic behavior that it didn't happen automatically, but over time we developed in the CT space. Well, my argument was take those patterns of learning and behavior to other national security challenges and we'll all be better and safer as a result of that. And then the second part of what I'd said was, and come back someday too. Come back with the insights and knowledge that you gain by working another problem set, and that'll make you a better leader, thinker, and analyst, whatever your role is, should you return to the counterterrorism space in a more senior role. So it's hard to tell anyone stay on the same topic, work the same problem set for a 25, 30-year government career. But I think there's a lot to be, but how do you strike that balance between having a diverse set of career experiences and developing deep, enduring expertise? That's always a challenge for professionals across any field of endeavor. So I guess that's one way I think about the question of kind of workforce maintenance and investment in workforce. If you let some of those really talented people go off and do other things, they'll come back better and more capable, and they'll also be refreshed and with even greater enthusiasm for the CT mission. At least that's the way I've thought about it.
Well, thank you. And to that point, I mean, you talked about the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, so that's what you did prior to your latest role. How did stepping outside of government after a long career in government inform your current role?
Well, I think one of the things was it kind of opened my eyes, and I've said this publicly in other settings when I was GIF-CT director, it opened my eyes to the growing parity and equality between what I mentioned in my remarks, knowledge inside government and knowledge outside government, or in the academic world with respect to terrorism and counterterrorism. Again, when you're inside government exclusively, you might reach the conclusion that because we have this unique and privileged access to intelligence information, the best signals intelligence, the best human intelligence, that we know what's being said inside that room where the terrorists are hatching their plot, that we somehow have all that there is to know about terrorism or counterterrorism. My experience at GIF-CT told me what should have been obvious all along, and I regret that it wasn't obvious earlier in my career, and that is, particularly because of the open source domain in which so many terrorist and extremist organizations operate, that playing field is being leveled even more every day. It's being leveled because so much more of this information is available to the non-cleared community. It's also, sadly and unfortunately, true because the set of terrorist adversaries that we face is more clever and more adaptive than they had been before. They know how we collect intelligence information. They know how to use tools like encrypted applications and encrypted communication tools to evade our traditional means of intelligence collection. So again, this is leveling the playing field in a way that I think underscores how important it is that we have a healthy, well-resourced, robust academic companion to what government does on counterterrorism. And I wouldn't have said that 10 years ago, but I believe it now.
I want to tell the audience quickly, you may see on your schedules we're breaking. We're going to go right through that. You had a nice long lunch, and I want to use this opportunity, because Nick is willing and he is here, to really ask him what you need to know that will help inform your research. And so, you know, I'm just thinking through what you said in the beginning, Nick. You said, you know, you have to be everything everywhere all at once. You are the CT coordinator of this large, massive organization, and you've asked us for help with priorities. But what do you see as the burning priorities and a list of burning priorities?
This is one of the things I sometimes worry about, the thing that is the most on your worry list that day. If that becomes your top priority, then you're not thinking strategically enough. But right now, unfortunately, and that's why I mentioned in the remarks, the set of the convergence of the migration challenge and the terrorism, Homeland Security challenge right now feels like something that we just have to get a better grip on. Most of the last decade, there have been political critics who have said that terrorists are streaming across the southern border. And we could look at that analytically, as our intelligence and law enforcement community did, and say, no, that's actually not happening. It's not true. And I would argue it's not true today as well, but what we face today is a greater vulnerability to the possibility that terrorist organizations might use that pathway to get individuals into the United States. So that puts more pressure on our counterterrorism community and requires that we up our game in this space. So I think of that as probably highest on my worry and priority list today. But as I also said in my remarks, when you step back and think strategically about where we are as a country, the DVE set of challenges that we face is probably holds the potential to be more undermining of our social fabric than any other form of terrorism threat that we face. At least that's how I see it. And so that, as I said, was what motivated me to return to government and try to attack and work on that particular set of issues. And I think that speaks a little bit to the overall, the kind of the nature of counterterrorism work. You are not allowed the luxury of a single priority. The Biden administration, at the start of the administration, did a great job of saying we're going to have a stricter adherence to prioritization schemes in how we do and resource counterterrorism work. We're not going to try to care about everything everywhere all at once. And so if Region A over here presents a real and acute homeland threat, that's where our priority attention is going to be. And if Region B over here has a really raging set of terrorism problems in that part of the world, but they don't manifest themselves in homeland threat to the United States at this moment, then that's going to be a Tier 2 or Tier 3 priority because we just can't do it all at once. And I think that is a really strong, wise, and healthy approach until things change. And then you wake up one morning and the world has changed in Region A or in Region B, and you find yourself having to readjust your priorities on the fly. And I think is the challenge that we face as a counterterrorism community is how to rigorously stick to prioritization schemes when our landscape is so dynamic. And it's hard to, when you divest or disinvest from places abroad where we don't see threat today, we lose insight and understanding, and we risk strategic surprise. And that, so I've used the phrase manage and mitigate risk, that's what I mean. How do you manage and mitigate risk in an environment where you've foregone insight and understanding? And that's a hard place to be.
I know we have a question from online.
This is from the online audience. Speaking of terminology, how would you distinguish between terrorism and targeted violence?
I hate definition questions because there are statutory definitions, there's definitions that you use to guide your research. I guess I think of those as being interconnected Venn diagrammed phenomena. There are certainly acts of targeted violence, aggression against a particular community because that community is that community, that are also acts of terrorism in that they aim to drive or foment political change or intimidate a civilian population. So I think those are intertwined, and I honestly don't spend a lot of time trying to disaggregate them in a way to kind of pull them apart much more than that. I'm not sure there are too many other partner countries around the world who use the terminology targeted violence in the same way that we do, as frequently as we do. I could be wrong about that. Some of our foreign colleagues and partners can tell me if I'm wrong. But I think we've tried to put a finer point on the idea that there can be some forms of violence that are heinous and targeted, but still may not meet some strict definition of terrorism because it may not drive toward political outcome in the same way that a terrorist movement would drive toward some form of political outcome. That's why I'm not a scholar, I'm a practitioner, so that I don't have to live by definitions. So,
Thank you online for that question. We have a question in the back of the room. Camden's running.
far away as you can be.
Hi there. Thank you so much for being here today. So I study creativity and innovation in organizations, and in that research, what you often find is that organizations that encourage risk-taking, trial and error, those sorts of things, that's a positive. But you mentioned in an earlier comment that we really don't have room or space or the capability to engage in trial and error. I can appreciate that, certainly, but what advice might you have for us to sort of balance the culture of innovation with lack of being able to try things out and take risk?
It's a great question, and I guess I would never want to say anything that would suggest we should kind of stifle innovation in risk-taking. I was speaking of it in my remarks in the very specific and highly politicized context of prevention work, where, at least in my experience, it's so easy for us, the government or the community of practitioners who engage in prevention work, to have that work mischaracterized. Oh, it's veiled law enforcement or intelligence gathering work. Oh, it's the government trying to manage a particular diaspora population and its threat concerns about that population. Usually when we suffered critiques like that, at least in my experience when I was in government the first time, I would try to argue that we should still not be dissuaded from doing this work, even if we are subject to criticism, because there's no other way to attack this problem but to try. And often the critiques that would come in this space, particularly from opponents, would be, well, you have no data to validate that your work prevents anything, that is, prevented an attack. And we couldn't argue with that. We lacked the kind of data that would say, but for X, Y didn't happen. But I think we were in a strong position to say, doing nothing is not a public policy strategy that stands up to any scrutiny. And I think that has helped us at least gain a little bit of breathing space to try to be innovative and to try to adapt our approaches. And I'd like to think we've gained a lot of learning by the earlier attempts to engage in prevention work, and I think that's largely what has taken us in the direction that we are moving, which is adopting a public health-informed approach to prevention work that, in a sense, aims to desecuritize something that is probably still inherently a security-related problem, but to package it in such a way and shape it in such a way that the community understands that the thinking behind it, the reasoning behind it is designed to create a healthier, safer community, not to advance the work of our law enforcement community. And we're still dealing with a tremendous amount of legacy suspicion around these issues and these programs, but I'd like to think that over time, sticking to that approach, using that language, meaning that language, we have a greater chance of overcoming that stigma than we would have had otherwise. But I'd like to, but that has come from innovation in the way we think about the prevention mission. So the last thing I'd want to do is send a message that we shouldn't be trying to innovate in this work.
Thank you for that. Hang with us just a second, Nick. I want to invite some members of our audience who have to catch flights. We had a shuttle outside for them, and if you need to depart, do it during the time I'm talking. I'm not important here. So if you need to go to get that shuttle, I want to give you a chance to do so right now. And if you do have another question for Nick, I think we could probably take 1 to 2 more before we get our panel going. Okay, well, the chief scientist has a question. I guess we better let the chief scientist.
Please. Small liberal arts college in New England, I couldn't answer any.
Oh, that's not true. So thinking about how the theory of conflict and war is changing, right? And looking forward beyond kind of the immediate threats that you've identified, what do you think the context of terrorism means in the future state-on-state kind of concept were it to emerge?
It's a great question, because I think one of the things you have to do when you kind of quickly survey the landscape is skip over some stuff. And if you were sitting in a skiff on a given day worrying about threat stuff, it's a pretty good chance you'd be worrying, well, we are worrying about some terrorism-related threats tied to state actors. Either they are engaged in that terrorism-related activity directly, they're trying to do it in a deniable way so that it isn't attributed to that state actor, or they are supporting it, contributing to it. And so I think that the state sponsorship of terrorism has always been a feature of our landscape. It is probably less talked about now outside the specific context of perhaps Iran right now, but it remains a central feature of not only our global threat landscape, but our homeland threat landscape. And I can point to publicly available stuff that has talked about what Iran has tried to do to dissident communities here in the dissident Iranians here in the United States, the documented threats aimed at senior level government officials who were perceived to have been hard on Iran in their policy work. And certainly our other countries around this room have their own experiences with state sponsors who've sought to. Now, state-sponsored terrorism, though, of course, blurs up against other forms of state coercion and influence that we are also seeing. The efforts of hostile state actors to interfere in our politics, to create and foment discord and social discontent, that's all a continuum. And I think we should see it as a continuum. And I think that's probably something we weren't thinking about 3, 4, 5 years ago. We thought of these in isolated pockets. And again, this is where government suffers sometimes. In government, because sometimes our information on these particular topics is among the most sensitive and some of the most guarded, tightly guarded information, it's contained in some of the tightest boxes and compartments, which makes it harder to think of these activities along a spectrum of activity the way I just described. I'm not critiquing our intelligence community in that regard, I'm just describing a reality. So it puts a greater pressure on a smaller number of individuals to do all of the thinking about some of these topics because the information is held so tightly. But you put your finger on something where state actors are very much active in this space.
Nick, I'm going to take the very last question for myself because I have the microphone. Nobody else can do it. And then I'm going to ask our panelists for session 8, just get ready. We're going to add a few chairs and some microphones, so just know we haven't forgotten about you. We want to hear from you. But Nick, I think about your long career. I think about working for 4 presidents. I think about the state we're in. And man, you get up and go to work every day. You didn't have to take this job. You could have signed out and had a wonderful career. What keeps you in it?
Well, I have to say, GIFT CT, working with technology companies, who wouldn't want to work with technology companies every single day of their work life? Well, quite kind of simply put, coming back to government for me was people. There are a couple of key people in key roles at the Department of Homeland Security who I consider long-term friends, colleagues, and mentors. And when people like that, like any of you in any work that you do, when you think about what you want to do next, you want to work most with people that you admire, respect, and feel connected to. And so without naming names, there are a couple of those individuals in the Department of Homeland Security that have played that role across my career. And so the pitch to come back and work with those individuals in this space was pretty hard to say no to. Also, as I said a little bit in my remarks, I just felt like, particularly in a couple of areas where I cared about, prevention work being one of them, we still weren't where we needed to be, and it was I had a great sense of regret from my service earlier in government that we hadn't done more to cement durable prevention approaches in our government the way we had wanted to, with a sustained resource base, all of those things. So I felt like that was something to come back that I could, hopefully find a way to impact directly by coming back. It also helped that it was 2 years into an administration, so I could say to myself, this is really only a 2-year thing, and then we'll see what happens after that. So it's a sprint. But as I said, the team of people that we work with at DHS, and I see so many DHS faces in the audience who are part of that team, I mean, that's what makes it rewarding, is the chance to work with people you admire and respect. And again, I don't make the argument that that's true only in the government context. It's true in every one of your professional environments. I used to tell my students in class, you choose professors, not classes. You're drawn to people rather than topics. So I guess that's the best answer I could give.
I think that's a great way to end this. We could talk to you much longer, but thank you so much for coming to Omaha and sharing these words with us. So let's give him a round of applause, please.
Thanks, Aaron.